Right. I called him. It was like 10 o'clock at night. The office was locked. He was not going to get into the office. I was there early. And when I got there, he wasn't there. I went into his office, opened it up, and found it. So he surfaced 3 days later in the hands of the FBI. And the FBI called me and said, we've got the CFO.
Welcome to The Career Circus, the story night podcast that uncovers crazy career stories. The stories that you tell your friends over drinks that are just too wild, too funny, or too awkward to keep to yourself. This podcast is where we bring these stories to life. Each week, we're joined by incredible guests from the worlds of politics, business, government, sports, and media who are brave enough to share their most unbelievable career stories. From surprising screw-ups to hilarious misunderstandings, we're exploring the lighter, stranger side of professional life. So get ready to be shocked and tickled, because this is where career paths get truly entertaining. And today, we're incredibly lucky to be joined by the legendary Dennis Chookaszian. He's the former chairman and CEO of CNA Insurance, an organization he led for 26 years, and also served as the CEO of Empower, an internet startup. Dennis has served as the director on boards of 13 publicly traded companies and currently sits on the board of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, Career Education Corp, and Pillarstone Capital. He's got a board position for 20 private companies and 7 nonprofit orgs. Dennis also teaches corporate governance at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and he joins us now from Chicago. Welcome, Dennis. Thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks to my mother for writing it.
So you've had a very long and successful career, pre and post leading companies as a CEO. You've been on boards, you've been teaching for a long time. Is there a single most crazy or funny or unusual experience that stands out from that span?
There were so many of them that it's hard to pick out one, but I've had many experiences that were just, you just can't make this stuff up. I will tell you one that was kind of an interesting one. I'll leave the company's name out, but it was a public company. And I've been on the board of 13 public companies over the course of my career. I chaired the audit committee in this company, and we got a report that the CEO and the CFO were both having affairs, and they were involved with employees of the company. And of course, that's not good. And as chair of the audit committee, I had to pursue it. So I went to the CEO and said, look, we've got this report. And I said, is this true? And he said, absolutely not. He said, it's not, there's no truth to this. I don't have a girlfriend or anything like that. I've never done these things. And I said, now, we have to investigate this. And he said, I certainly understand. And so I said, okay, I'm going to do that. So I went, investigated, and talked to the women that were named. They said, no, we don't know anything about this. And so it was obviously a nonsense story. It had been made up. So I went back to him and said, okay, it appears there's nothing there, but what about the CFO? And he said, it doesn't make any sense. How could that possibly be? And I said, yeah, it probably doesn't make sense. So I said, we'll do the investigation, and first I'll go to him. And so I went to him, and I said to the gentleman, I said, well, there's this report that you have been having a relationship with another person, you have a child with that person, and it's something that your wife is not aware of. And he said, yeah, it's true. I went, what? So talk about not expecting an answer. There's an old statement, by the way, it says, never ask a question unless you know what answer you're going to get in advance. I did not expect that answer. And so then I said, come on, tell me, is this true? Yep, it's true. So I said, all right. So then I had to figure out, what do we do with this? And so interestingly, and the course I teach at the University of Chicago in business school is called governance, and it's about how you make decisions. And so one of the questions you have to ask yourself when you're in a leadership position is, what do you do now? And so understanding that, I started thinking this through. Well, first, his wife was not aware of it. Second, there are questions about the economics of this. And if this person is giving money to another person, there are potentially tax ramifications. He may or may not be filing his taxes accurately. So there's a lot of issues here. So I pursued this a little bit further to understand what would happen here. And first, since they did have a child and he was giving her money, no problem, child support, so that was not an issue. So there was no tax issue. But then on the relationship with his wife did not know about it. And I said, okay, well, here's where we are. Either you tell her or we're going to tell her, because you are a blackmail risk. And we cannot allow you to have this undisclosed relationship and be with the company. And so he went ahead and told her. Of course, the relationship fell apart at that point in time. They got a divorce and he went to the other woman. But it was a talk about it's a surprising moment when I said that. And this guy's the last guy in the world I would have thought would have been involved in something like that. And so he left the company and things moved on, but it was quite a surprise. But I've had many, many things like that. There are things just out of the blue that you can't imagine. And also the unpredictable events that happen where you're involved in a business situation of one kind or another. You think you know what's going to go on, and then you have something like the 2008 real estate collapse and everything falls apart on you. So there are many things that go on like that.
Over your career, there must have been many moments, right? Like 2008 crash, 9/11. Is there anything that an external event like that took place and that you had to respond that ended up being an experience you couldn't have predicted and you couldn't have prepared for?
Yes, there are a lot of things like that were problems. There's one that some of them are induced by the company and some of their externalities. So the externalities are pretty clear. It was 1987 flash crash and what went on at that time in the markets and the change in the market structure at that point. There was there was what happened with just before Sarbanes-Oxley with the Enron and WorldCom failures that brought about Sarbanes-Oxley. That brought about huge changes. There was 9/11, as you mentioned. That's obviously a big event. There was the 2008 collapse in the financial markets. So there have been a lot of things like that. They happen, it seems like every 5 or 10 years, something really bad happens, and you've got to respond to it. And then some are induced by the company itself. One of the actually interesting things, this is public information, so I can talk about it. And one of the companies I was on the board of, it was an 8-person board, and the company was doing really well. And the company was in the subprime automobile insurance, subprime auto finance business, and they made loans to people who didn't have good credit for cars at higher rates, obviously. And so the company was doing really well, and the CEO was kind of a high flyer on Wall Street. It was one of the fastest growing companies, lots of great things. He'd made a lot of money by doing this, and then the market turned down. And this was back in roughly 1995, when we started the market turned down. And we reported our earnings, and when we looked at the earnings were not turning down like everybody else. So I said to him, gee, John, what's going on, John? How come we're doing so well? And he had a bunch of reasons. Well, we're tougher, we're good at repos, a bunch of things that we do. So a year went by, and now the market turned down even more, and we're still doing well. And so what had happened in the first year, he had projected that earnings were going to be around $40 million. And at the last moment, they came in at $39 million. And so he went to the CFO and said, I need $1 million more in earnings. And the CFO, who was afraid of his own shadow and was intimidated by the CEO, just added $1 million to earnings. It's kind of crazy. And the auditors missed it. The auditors didn't catch that. It was called a post-closing entry, audit adjustment, and it wasn't caught by the outside auditors. So they missed $1 million. Next year, and the CFO thought, well, I'll make it up next year. Next year, things went further south. And so he posted another $3 million on top of that. The earnings forecast was for like 42 or 3, and they were again back around 39. So he added another 3 to it. So now he's $4 million in the hole. And now that doesn't sound like a big number today, but remember this quite some ago. He ended up at that point moving along. We asked him the question again, John, what's going on here? The industry is doing poorly and you're doing great. And again, same story. Why? Repo more cars. I'm tougher. Run the branches better. Then the beginning of the following year, again, it seems like the market's turning out even more. So I said, John, bring me, what I'd like to do is I'd like to see the repo inventory, because the repo inventory is usually about $25 million of cars that we had that were in repo. And if that number goes up, it means you're having bigger defaults. Following quarter, he brings in a report, filled $25 million. What we didn't know is he tore the second page off the report, actually $50 million, which would have immediately told you, of course, that everything was going into the dumper. So now it's really starting to go downhill, and we see this report, and now he puts in quarter by quarter, he's putting in a lot of money. He gets $20 million further into the hole, which at that time was a huge number for this company. And so things are going along, and he shows us this report, looks okay from a board point of view. And then we cut the end of the year in December, we're starting to work on the audit, and a young auditor who works for the audit firm, because the auditors missed the first 2 years and the beginning of the third year. And this young woman says, I'm a little puzzled by this. I'm just looking at this, and I'm looking at the trial balance, which is your accounting statements in the company, and it doesn't equal the number that's published to the outside world in the 10K. Is there a reason for that? And how come that's different? And of course, the audit partner went, what? Because he knew it has to be the same. You can't have a different number inside and outside. And so they immediately said, oh my God, what's that? And so they called the CFO, they called me. And so I make a call to the CFO. I said, I want to see you tomorrow morning, 7 a.m., be in the office. We get in at 7 a.m. He's not there. He's gone. The CFO is gone. And I asked the CEO about it. He says, oh, no, I don't know anything about it. He feigns ignorance. So I go into the CFO's office, pull out the drawer, and there in his drawer, right on top of the drawer, because he was very organized, was neatly in handwriting. Here's my post-closing trial balance adjustments, and here's $1 million here this year, here's $3 million this year, here's $20 million the next year. And he had it all laid out right there in the drawer. And so obviously, talk about shock, that was a shock. So we went back to the CEO, who contended he knew nothing about it. None of us believed him. We fired him. And then the 7 of us had to take over, the 7 board members remaining, we had to take over and run the company for 6 months before we could turn it around. It resulted in a Chapter 11 bankruptcy. So there's stories like that you just can't make up. It's just like, how could this possibly happen? But it led me to understand another element of it, though, and that the more you've been around, the more boards you've been on, the more you've seen, is you start to pick up little telltale signs. And the one thing that was pretty obvious in this case is that the CFO was afraid of his own shadow. And whenever he'd be in a board meeting, the CEO would say something, and the CFO would look around like this, very nervous. And he was a very heavy chain smoker. There's a lot of things about this that should have led you to believe it was a problem. And so, I've been through many things like that, the corporate side. And, indiscretions on the part of management with their relationship with employees. It's pretty amazing what you hear when you've been around for a while.
You know what's crazy about all of this is that every time you see an executive have an affair with somebody who's in their organization, for example, as Jeff Shell did at NBC a couple of years ago, it surprises me, but it doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me because it happens all the time, but it surprises me because that story never ends well for anybody, and everybody knows that, and yet people still do it, thinking it won't happen to me, I'll be discreet, but in the end, everybody gets caught.
Yeah, and the situations that I've been in where somebody was trying to mask it, you can't mask it. You can tell, most of us who've been around a little while, you can tell whether people have a close affection for one another or not. So trying to mask it is complete craziness. You can't.
Yeah, eventually your luck just runs out, doesn't it? And the story you just shared, the CFO, so it looks like he wasn't there when you went at 7 a.m., but he left incriminating evidence in his desk.
Because we called him late at night, and he couldn't come back to the office. So, because I called him, it was like 10 o'clock at night. The office was locked. He was not going to get into the office. I was there early, and when I got there, he wasn't there. I went into his office, opened it up, and found it. So he surfaced 3 days later in the hands of the FBI. And the FBI called me and said, we've got the CFO, claims that there's this accounting fraud and it was perpetrated by the CEO and he had to do it. So he implicates the CEO. And then we immediately fired the CEO when that happened. And then from the CEO's perspective, that precipitated investigation, lawsuits, because this was a major fraud. The whole company collapsed. The company was a high-flying stock. Went into Chapter 11. We had debtor in possession financing. It was really pretty bad. But as that's going on, then we're in the middle of this case, and we asked to talk to the CFO, and the FBI won't let us talk to him. They said, no, we're making our case. This is a federal case, and we're going to bring this suit against them with the SEC. So they start doing that. So we never talked to him. I never saw him again. And then from the CEO's perspective, one of the best things that happened is that about 6 months later, this guy was a very heavy chain smoker. He was in his mid-40s, and he had a heart attack while driving a car on the expressway in Chicago, pulled over to the side and died. Now, yeah, so it's sad. He had a family and the whole thing, but he was real nervous. He died of all the heavy smoking was really what killed him. And he, at that point, from the CEO's perspective, now it was his word against the dead man. And he said, I don't know anything about it. He did all these things. He said, it was accurate to say he didn't have a financial background. And I used to say, if you gave him 2 numbers, he'd cut himself with them. He had no idea what numbers were, but he understood the bottom line number and how important it was and how it was reported. So he obviously did that. So it took a while to get the thing resolved. And the CEO, as a result of that, I had to testify before the grand jury several times. And he ended up getting 15 years in prison. And he served, I think, 13 years of it and then just got out a year or two ago.
Wow. It's funny because, well, firstly, if you keep cooking the books, you get found out, especially if you're growing like clockwork, right? If you forecast 40 and you hit 40 again and again and again in a down market, as you described, you don't have to be a forensic accountant to figure out something's fishy here.
Somebody figures that out. We had another circumstance that I was involved in where we had one of our offices had it was a pretty successful office, and we had one of the sales guys kept looking at his reports that were coming out saying, this is not properly reflecting the sales that I made. I made a lot more sales than this. And the guy who was the CFO of the office, the controller of the office, who reported to the branch manager, everybody loved this guy. He was everybody's best friend, and he was always getting people deals on things. Like you'd say, here's a TV set, and it was a $500 TV set, and he could get it for you for $200. So what he was doing was he was taking money from the company, and he was recording it as a deduction from the accounts of this one guy and others. And so the reports that they got out showed that they had a lot less sales because it was the revenue minus these deductions. That's how he ran it through the books. And then he took the cash. So what he did is he'd take the cash and he'd go and buy TV sets and with the cash at full price, and he'd sell it to somebody for half the price. And so they loved the guy, and he'd make, so his cost of goods sold as a business was zero. He got the product for free. And he did that, and he managed to get away with $8 million by doing that. And the only way we finally found it, because it was so buried, the auditors didn't catch it, the external auditors, the internal auditors didn't catch it. It was because this one salesman said, look, he kept going to the CFO and said, my reports are wrong. And he said, oh, those systems are screwed up. Just ignore it. Doesn't mean anything. Eventually, he called and complained to me. And when I heard it, I said, something's wrong here. So I sent a team out to investigate. We found it right away. But it's funny how you can bury things so deep that it's not going to be found by the normal controls. So anyway, we're talking a lot about frauds and things and indiscretions, things of that nature. But those are the crazy things that go on. And then market change and things that go on in market change. One of the biggest changes that affected me was that on a more personal basis, after I'd retired from CNA, my son and I, we were doing building construction, and we bought in Florida, a little bit north of Tampa, there's a wonderful little town called Yankeetown. And at that time, this was 2005, 6, 7, you saw the resurgence after 9/11, and boating was a big deal. In Miami, they were selling documiniums, a place where you could buy a dock for your boat and you'd own it like a condominium. And they were selling for $500,000 to $1 million. We saw this bucolic little place in Tampa, and we thought we could do the same thing, but there's a couple of very small marinas there. So we bought up a big chunk of the waterfront with the idea of building these out. We thought we could easily get $100,000 for a documinium because they were getting $500,000 on the other coast. And we probably could have until 2008. When everything crashed, you couldn't give a boat away, a boat slip. So we were stuck with all of this property. And it took me almost 15 years to work out of it. And it was a long time to get the whole thing solved because we had to get all the debt paid down, one problem after another. So sometimes things just happened that it was hard to predict the 2008 collapse. Things were going strong. Before that, you had Countrywide Financial with the mortgages, the whole story. So it was a pretty amazing how that happens because there was no market. It took us that long. So that was 2008, and it wasn't until 2020. Let's see, it was around 2020. Well, maybe not 15, maybe like 12 or 13 years. It was like 2000 or 2021 by the time we finally got the whole thing worked out.
Wow. And your career is so broad that we need to switch gears a little bit because you've taught at Northwestern, you currently teach at the University of Chicago. That's a very different environment to board positions, a different environment to being a CEO of a large corporation. But I imagine there's still enough that happens in the classroom that may surprise you from time to time.
Yeah, there's so many funny stories. One that's my favorite is that, and you'll remember from the class, we have 130 students a year in 2 sections, and I'll, at the beginning of the class, try to identify who the students are. They're mostly business school students, but we have a few lawyers in the class. And we had one young woman who was an attorney. She had a law degree and worked in a law firm. And so as part of the class, I would call on students to say, well, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? And knowing that she was an attorney, we got to one section and I started referring to the fact that when Sarbanes-Oxley was passed, it set up criminal penalties in addition to civil penalties. And so I said to her, I said to the young lady, we'll go unnamed here, and I said, why don't you tell the class the difference between criminal and civil law? And she went, oh, I'm not sure if we covered that in her course. You're a lawyer and you don't know the difference between criminal law and civil law? It's like, what's the second question? I can't even ask a second question if you can't answer that one. It was hysterical. And my teaching assistant at the time was also an attorney. He was doubled up in laugh. He couldn't believe it either, that she didn't know the difference between criminal and civil law.
Crikey, maybe she needs a refund on law school. I remember you asking that question when I was in your class, and I think, I'm no lawyer, but it's a pretty simple answer. If it's civil, you pay a fine. If it's criminal, you go to jail.
It's not complicated. She couldn't tell the difference between civil and criminal laws. And, there's, again, this old saying about, I mentioned earlier, is that don't ask a question unless you know the answer you're going to get. Make sure you know the answer you're going to get.
Yeah, your class of the 20 I took when I was in business school really stood out for me because it was, and I tell this story, it's not a wild story, it's not a funny story, but it's an interesting anecdote that I like to share since I graduated from Booth, which is your class was very popular, a reflection of your teaching, your personalities, and the stories that you tell, the people you bring in. But I would also argue a reflection of the fact that the final was a trip to Aspen to go skiing, which is a pretty unique way to end a class in grad school. That was something that really stood out. And then also, you're very generous and kind enough to allow your students to visit your home. And I remember visiting you in your home, and there's a fire pole or fireman pole. I don't know if it's still there.
We do. And anybody who comes to my home, I get them pole certified. They get a sticker that says they're pole certified. And when you walk around Booth, you'll see a lot of people with pole certified sticker on their computers.
I think I have that certification because I remember sliding down that pole, and one of my classmates took a video of me sliding down the pole and then posted it to Twitter and tagged me in it. Or I posted it, I can't remember. And my uncle in England started making insinuations about me and poles, to put it mildly.
Well, when you get a pole certified sticker, and particularly for the men, if they've got a pole certified sticker stuck on their shirt and they go home, how do they explain that to their wife? It's a little, not quite the same. But yeah, it's funny. And we do still do the seminar in Aspen after the class 10 is in Aspen for those who can join. This year we had 80 students there. There's 130 in the class join in person, joined by Zoom for the last class. The other 9 are in Chicago. And we actually had a funny event this year. When we're there, and I've been in Aspen since, this is my 63rd year skiing in Aspen, and I just love it there. We own the hotel there, and it's a family business. My children are all involved in the business with me. And so we have the students there again in March, and it happened that the weekend of the seminar, the Aspen uphill, where you have to go from the base of Aspen to the top of Aspen Mountain, and it's a 3,000 foot elevation climb, and you're at 8,000 when you start and you're at 11,000 at the end. So it's pretty rigorous. And so I said, it is a race. And so I said, who would like to do it? And 10 of the 80 students said, yeah, I'll do it. This is great. I'm fit. I do all these things. I said, great. So I said, okay, we'll all show up together and we'll start. And they said, great, we'll all go together. I said, no, I've done this before. I understand this. I used to be able to do it in an hour and a half. It's going to take me over 3 hours because I'm older. And when you get older, even though I'm strong and fit, but your heart rate, you have to keep under 140 as you get older. It's not smart to run your heart rate faster than that. So you just have to go a little bit slower and keep your heart rate down. They said, no, you can. I said, look, I can't. I'll meet you at the top. You go ahead. It'll take me 3 hours. If you get up there in an hour and a half, you don't want to wait for me, fine. But you should be able to get up there in an hour and a half to 2 hours, something like that. So we start out. We get maybe 5% up the hill. We're not even to the top of the first lift there. And I catch up to them. I said, what's going on? They said, this is real. All 10 of them said, this is really hard. I said, yeah, it's hard. Come on, we can do it. So I said, okay, slow down, go at my pace. And it'll take 3 hours, but let's go at my pace. So we start out and we get another I don't know, we didn't get more than another 10 or 15 minutes into it. And they all said, we can't do this. It's too hard. Let's go down. I said, I'm not going down. I said, so all 10 of them turned around and went down, and I finished. I went to the top. And so that night at dinner time, I had bragging rights. So it was really funny. So I said, how do you feel by getting beat by an old guy? So, but it's always a lot of fun dealing with students.
And the hotel that you own in Aspen, you mentioned that you've owned it for a number of years. But the fact that you own that asset, that must have thrown up some curveballs over the years, I imagine, from guests, from staff, from something else.
Well, oh yeah, really fun. Well, first of all, we bought a rundown. When I was at CNA, we owned a couple of houses there, and I've always believed that if you had a second home, the way to own a second home is to rent it when you're not using it, so it brings income in. And we owned homes there since the 80s, two of them since the 80s, and they were all economically positive. So you get your vacation for free and you make money if you do that. And then when I retired from CNA in 99, I really wanted more of an attachment to the town. So a hotel had been on the market for several years, and they couldn't sell it because the market was kind of soft, and it was a rundown ski hotel. And the woman who owned it was a nut job. And one of the conditions was you couldn't do an inspection. You couldn't bring an inspector in. Well, so I said, I'm an engineer. I'm a chemical engineer. So I said, I'll do the inspection myself. I don't need to bring an outside inspector in. So I did the inspection and understood it was a lot of bad stuff, including asbestos. And I knew I was going to have to do a tear down. So we bought it with the idea we'd tear it down. And so we bought it, got it at a very low price. I tore it down, built a new hotel on the site. It took longer than it should have because the first contractor went bankrupt, and then we had to work through that. Eventually, we reopened it, and then I named it after my mother. It's called the Annabelle. My mother was Annabelle, and it's the Annabelle Inn, so we named it after her. So the hotel is doing great, but in this interim period as we were building it, Aspen has a bear problem. There's a lot of bears in town, brown bears, and there's brown bears and black bears. And the brown bears are the ones, the grizzlies, those are really dangerous. The blackbeards, all bears are dangerous, but this one's not as dangerous. And they have them in town all the time. So in Aspen, if you go to the garbage containers, you can't open the lid. It's got a thing where you got to stick your hand in it and move it to the side, which a bear can't do. And actually, the way they started these initially is they would just put a rod across it. The bears figured out how to pull the rods out. So they went to these other container locks on it. A bear was coming down Main Street. And at that time, in the old hotel before construction, it was floor-to-ceiling glass in the front of the hotel. A bear crashed, didn't see, obviously couldn't tell the glass, crashed into the lobby. The manager's sitting there. He looks up and he sees this big black bear in the lobby. And he's like petrified. The bear spins around, crashes out the other side into the courtyard because it's a square with a courtyard, crashes out into the courtyard area, climbs a 50-foot tree that's out there in the courtyard. So he's like, what do I do? He calls the police. They send the game warden. The game warden gets a tranquilizer gun, shoots the bear. The bear collapses, falls to the ground. They load him on a truck and haul him back up into the woods. A bear, he's fallen through branches in the trees. Yeah, a bear can fall that far, and and he really was slowed down a lot by the branches coming down. They had to get him out of the tree.
That must have been pretty petrifying for the staff because, even if you're aware bears exist in the neighborhood and you see bear warnings and you treat garbage a certain way because of bear risk, you still don't expect to see one.
You don't expect to see a bear. My wife, this is actually not too long ago, 6 or 7 years ago, she was walking down the alley right behind it, and she thought she saw a big dog. And it turned out it was a bear. And so the story when you see a bear is don't run. Just slowly turn around and back in the other direction or back up. And the bear doesn't want to hurt you. The bear's just after food. The black bears, the brown bears are dangerous.
I remember going on a hike in Colorado, and at the start of the trail, there was a bear sign. And I thought to myself, wow, it would be so cool if I saw a bear today by the time I get to the top of this mountain. And then upon further reflection, it was like, no, it's probably cooler if I don't see a bear. No, I really don't want to see a bear.
Yeah, it's like the guys who, these two guys were walking through the woods and they come across a bear. And you may have heard the story before, but they come across a bear and they go, oh my God, let's get out of here. So they start running. And then one guy sits down and he pulls his backpack, pulls some running shoes out. And the other guy yells, what are you doing? You can't outrun the bear just because you're putting on tennis shoes. And he said, I don't have to outrun the bear. I just have to outrun you.
That's great because A, it's a funny story, but B, it's a great analogy for business, because in business I feel like you don't necessarily need to be the smartest or sell the best product, but you've got to sell something to somebody who's slightly less capable, or put it crudely, dumber than you, right? It's not just even business, right? You can see this in politics. So for example, look at politicians. Do they know everything? Do they have a firm grip on every policy issue? Not really. They don't, but they also don't need to, because they just need to convince somebody who's less informed than them to put their trust in them.
I think that's right. The other thing that is truly both amazing as to what it's going to do, but scary in terms of its potential, is what's happening with AI. And I teach a new course that I just started teaching on the use of AI. And I've been involved in 4 AI companies actually over the last 20 years. It's pretty amazing what's going on. When you start looking at their actual use of it, it's something which people aren't using to its potential. And this course I have that I'm teaching is to explain to people how to use it, which will change their life. It's completely changed the way you look at things. It's amazing how over the years in my business career, how there have been certain things that have changed everything that you're doing in the way you do business. So one was the advent of voicemail and email. Another was the advent of the internet and search capabilities. And it changed everything in the way you could do things and sell and communicate. And another one, of course, was the rise of the rise up of AI and what that's doing over the last 4 or 5 years. But it hasn't reached anywhere near its potential in the way people are actually using it. And what in this little class I teach, I say, if you're not using one of these advanced tools, the one I particularly like is Perplexity. I think that's a great tool. And if you aren't using it 10 times a day, you don't understand it. If you ever use Google search, you're a dinosaur. You should never use search. Anything I want to know, you go to Perplexity or another tool. And the interesting thing is what Elon Musk has now done with Grok 4. And Grok 4, with this new version of it, is dramatically better than the prior versions. So that's one of the most dramatic changes that I think you will see, certainly that I will see in my whole life.
So given what you know about AI from being immersed in the topic for about 20 years, and we've talked a lot about stories from the past, but if you had to imagine a story 5 or 10 years from now that involved AI and its ability to disrupt commerce or the economy or broader society, what's the story you'd tell?
I'll tell you a little story. Okay, so again, in this course I teach, I talk about how when I was a kid, a young boy, if I had read a report on, let's say, on Hoover Dam in the United States, what would I do? I'd get on my bicycle, ride to the library, go to the Encyclopedia Britannica, look it up, and write the stuff down. Okay, well, that changed dramatically when the internet came about, because that's narrow search. You had to know what you were looking for. Hoover Dam. Once the internet came up, I could say, "Tell me about dams." It would be Hoover Dam. It would give me all the different dams, and then I could do some comparisons and work with it. But the big change was the advent of AI that took that information and created a GPT, a generative pre-trained transformer. It turned it into an output that was usable, because search on the internet just gave you all these references. It gave you 3 million hits and you had to figure out what to do with it. But now it's done for you. And so that's what's transformative. People haven't quite understood how to use it. I'll give you an example. So when this first came out, and the original GPT tools, they were first published around 2017, but it was really 2022 when ChatGPT 3.0 came out that was really a usable tool. So when it first came out, and then Perplexity shortly followed, and I really like that as a better tool. So my daughter said that her daughter, our granddaughter, was going to be going to summer camp. So she said to my wife, why don't you and Dennis, why don't the two of you write letters to her and send them during camp? I said, great. We've done that for our grandchildren. He said, sure. Okay. So my wife gets out her paper and pencil and she starts writing. She has beautiful handwriting, spends an hour and a half or so writing this wonderful letter to her, and she gets it done. And so I said, Perplexity, Sabrina, marshmallows, camp songs, camp jokes, write it in the Hemingway style. 3 seconds later, I get this 3-page letter that says, Sabrina, it's an amazing time in your life. You'll walk through the woods, smell the trees, the acorns will fall around you. And here's some jokes to tell your friends. When you cook your marshmallows, do it like this. And I'm reading on, I'm going, this is unbelievable. I couldn't write this anywhere near as good. And then there's a sentence that says, beware the Sasquatch that might kidnap you and drag you into the woods. And I went, what? I edited it out because, interestingly, see, AI can't tell that's humor for an adult, not humor for a 10-year-old. So, and there are things it can't do, but it wrote me this beautiful letter that I edited, of course, and I got it in seconds. So everything in your life should be developed by using as a starting point that. Now, I've been doing expert witness testimonies. I've been asked to do them. And attorneys will say, well, here's a 100-page complaint and a 50-page response. Why don't you read it and we'll get together in a week and talk about it? I say, how about 5 minutes? They said, what? And I said, feed it into the tool. And I said, write me an expert witness report rebutting this. I get a 20-page report out of it in 5 seconds. Not 5 seconds. Actually, if you use Perplexity Pro, it takes you 2 minutes. But 2 minutes later, you get this unbelievable report that's not completely right. It's got problems in it. It's unbelievable how that changes everything you do. So this is going to be a game changer for people, and most people do not use it right. They don't understand it. If you're not using it 10 times a day, you don't understand it.
Yeah, it takes time to really get the right prompt. It requires a lot of back and forth. But when you do get it right, it's very satisfying because of the time savings and how good the output can be. But even now, the output still needs to be checked by a human.
For sure, you have to check it. But I'll be sitting in a board meeting, and boards have different protocols. Some allow you to have computers on, some don't. But assuming that I can have the computer on, I'm in a board meeting, somebody will talk about something, and they're thinking about how to do it. I'll put it into Perplexity. 5 seconds later, 10 seconds later, I get back this explanation of something they were trying to figure out. People say, boy, you're really smart. And I say, I'm not smart. AI is smart.
Well, good on you for admitting it. Earlier, you mentioned a tool, Perplexity. One AI tool that's caught the world by storm not long ago is DeepSeek from China. And I know China is a place that you've taught for a number of years, as well as India. I find both of those countries fascinating. I've been to both many times, and they're very, well, we talk about India and China as economic titans, very populous nations, but they're very, very different. China, to me, is very orderly, and India is very chaotic. I know there's more to it than that. How's your experience been teaching in both of those countries?
They're, if you take China, the US, and India, they are an apple, a banana, and a kumquat. They couldn't be more different. I will give you, just in terms of India versus China, teaching in both places. When I'd go to China, and I would be teaching, I taught at 2 universities, Jiaotong and Shenzhen, and I was teaching executive MBAs. I was teaching CEOs of Chinese companies. And these are very wealthy people, but these are people with no education because of the Cultural Revolution. When Mao in 1966 put in the Cultural Revolution, he closed all the universities and they didn't reopen until the 80s. And so as a consequence, if you were a young man and you were born in before that, like in the 50s, you were thrown out of school. You had to go and work the farms. That's all you could do. Now you're 20 years later, and you're like 25, 30 years old. You get a push cart, load it with T-shirts, push it around Shanghai, trying to sell T-shirts. And then 20 years later, you own a $200 million textile factory. So you have a lot of wealth. You're really smart for the people who did better. This course costs $250,000 a year, $250,000 for the course. It's an expensive course. So only wealthy people, these were all CEOs in it. Why were they taking it? They wanted the cachet of having an EMB to say, I've got a degree, because they didn't have anything, no high school degree, no college degree. So now they'd have an executive MBA from a top level school. So I taught there. So when I would teach there, they'd say, okay, class starts at 9:00. Everyone was in their seats at 5 minutes before 9. Nobody straggled in. And if they straggled in, everybody kind of look over, like if it ever did happen, it was just like, what are you doing? Everyone was in the seat on time. When I taught in India, I taught at a school called IIPM. The class would start at 9:00. I'd be there early. At 9:00, maybe out of, let's say there were 40 people in the class, there'd be 2 or 3 at 9:00. By 9:15, there'd be 10. By 9:30, there'd be about 25. And it wouldn't fill up till 10:00. Some people show up an hour late. And that's the norm in India. And in my teaching, that was my experience. And that now part of it, because it is chaotic, transportation is difficult. And if you look in China, the roadway systems are some of the best infrastructure in the world. Shanghai's got better infrastructure than Chicago. And the road systems in India, the road systems, the lane markings are advisory only. You can drive wherever you want. But I'll give you one other really startling comparison. I was in China 2 or 3 times a year for 12 years. Last time I was there was November of 2019. I was supposed to go back in April of 20, but COVID stopped everything in China. So I was back there about 6 months ago. My wife was with me, and we went to China, to Shanghai, and arrived in the evening. In the morning, we got up. I said, let's just go out for a quick walk. And so we went out, and it was eerily quiet. And I was like, what's going on? Because 19, you had all these gas motor scooters, different conveyances, but everything was gasoline at that time with a few electrics, almost no electrics back in 2019. And it was polluted. And very noisy. Now in Shanghai, when we were just there, everything's electric. So when these cars and stuff are zipping by you, it's quiet. You hear nothing because they're all electric, and the pollution levels are a lot lower than they were in Shanghai. Now, I didn't go to Beijing. I understand Beijing's still pretty polluted. But in Shanghai, it was amazingly different. And China was able to go in 5 years to virtually fully electric. And it's because of their political system where they said, sorry, no more gas cars. Well, you can't see that in the US. So their political system allows them to make huge changes overnight.
Well, yeah, China's succeeding with American ingenuity, with American technology, as all the patents of solar, electric, etc., all originated in the United States. So you'd expect the US should remain the leader, but through policy choices, China's very advanced, and the US is still choosing fossil fuels with drill, baby, drill.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And in the end, now, we're on a more serious note, in the end, there is only, in my opinion, there's only one solution to the energy problem, and that's nuclear. Because you can put in all the windmills you want and solar and all that. There's not enough power generation capability because the AI that we just talked about a moment ago, AI is going to double the amount of power consumption by 2030 that's needed. You're going to have twice the amount of power because these machines are growing at a pace and they'll be used at such a rate that you've got to fund them. And so what a lot of the people are doing, Zuckerberg at Meta is doing, a lot of people are doing is they realize that to power these data centers, they're going to have to build small nuclear plants next to them. And there's a new technologies which diminish the nuclear fallout risk, the risk of a meltdown. And there's these new technologies of small nuclear plants. My belief is that you get out 20 years or 30 years, there is only one choice, and that's nuclear. France is 80% nuclear. The United States was going to big nuclear, and then when 3 Mile Island happened, it got reversed, and all of the environmentalists, and not recognizing there is no choice. You got to make them better. You got to try to prevent that environmental risk, but there is no choice but to use nuclear. It's the only solution to the power problem. And nuclear is green. Nuclear is green as it gets. There's no emissions. There's no downside to it. And there's now a company called Deep Geo that is negotiating with several different countries to develop deep wells where they could put nuclear waste. Because what happens when, the reactor's got to replace the fuel every, whatever it is, 5 or 10 years. So you have to take that fuel. It's not very big in size, but it's got to be very sealed in lead and all of that. So you ship it to these different countries. There are several countries now that are saying that they will accept this. Somaliland, the Netherlands, surprisingly, has said that they will do this because they get paid a lot of money to store the nuclear waste. And if you can push it far enough underground, seal it, it should be okay. But in the end, the only solution to the world's issues really are it's going to be the use of nuclear is going to be what turns things around.
Well, this has been a really fascinating conversation. We've talked about board positions, CEO experiences, teaching. We're talking about nuclear, but there is one thing we haven't talked about, and that's your interest in comedy, an interest that I share. And so I thought it'd be fun to end with a story from your comedy exploits or a joke that you really enjoy telling.
Well, some of them are tied to leadership. One of my favorite stories about leadership is deciding what you want to do is to equate leadership and think about it in terms of sled dogs, like in Alaska. And the story is a very simple one in terms of leadership. If you're not the lead dog, the scenery never changes, and you know what you're looking at. So you want to be the lead dog. There's a good reason for that. And I do love comedy, and I play a lot of golf too. I love golf jokes, and I'll tell you one quick golf joke. So this guy's playing golf and with his wife, and he's having the best round of his career. And he gets the 14th hole, and he hooks a ball off into the woods. He goes, "Oh, this has ruined my round." And so his wife goes over with him, and they find the ball behind a shed. And she said, "Now wait a minute, this shed's got a door on both sides. I'll prop the door on the other side open. I'll come on your side. I'll hold it open here for you, put a 4-iron, and you can hit it right through to the green." He said, "Wow, that's an amazing idea." So he gets set up. He sets his club up. He strikes the ball. It comes up, and it strikes her in the forehead and kills her instantly. Tragic. So a few years go by. He remarries, and he's playing golf again with his new wife, and they get to that another great round. He gets to that same hole, hooks it off into the woods right behind that same shed. And his wife said, "Hey, I found the ball over here. Hey, look, there's a shed. I'll prop the door open on the other side. I'll stay on this side and hold it open, hood a 4-iron, knock it through." He said, "I'm not doing that. The last time I did that, I got a double bogey."
I don't have a golf joke, but since we talked about AI, I was trying to see how capable AI is when it comes to humor. And so I wrote this joke a while back and I fed the setup into ChatGPT and I asked the tool to give me a punchline. The setup was, Amazon has announced same-day shipping. I kept on asking ChatGPT, give me a punchline, give me a punchline, give me a punchline. It was really underwhelming. And so I would argue that ChatGPT could up its game and my punchline is better. So let me share it with you. Amazon has announced same-day shipping, not to be confused with Taco Bell, which offers same-day shipping. This has been a terrific conversation. I feel like we could have gone on a lot more, so perhaps we do this again another time, but you've been really insightful, entertaining, engaging, so thank you very, very much for coming on the show.
Great. Thanks, Ali. Good talking to you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to The Career Circus. This podcast was produced by Story Night, an independent communications consulting firm that delivers results through the power of storytelling. Story Night brings the talents of professional journalists, authors, and TV writers to craft compelling stories for athletes, executives, politicians, and businesses. To learn more, visit Story Night's website, story-night.com. On the next episode of The Career Circus, we'll hear from former health insurance executive turned whistleblower Wendell Potter. Wendell is now an advocate for healthcare reform after exposing the deceptive practices of the industry. Tune in to learn about the state of US healthcare and what comes next following the assassination of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson in New York City last December. But until then, goodbye.